Yeah, now I will switch off my camera and the virtual stage is yours, Phil.
All right. Let me actually share out my slide deck. I promise it's not super long or super detailed, but it's a good place to start. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, George. Thank you for inviting me to come and speak. My name's Phil Allen. I actually work at Microsoft, and I'm going to be talking about building microservices with Azure today using Visual Studio. So this is much more about the tooling in Visual Studio than it is about the Azure infrastructure and all the services and how they relate to each other, though I will touch upon it from time to time just as a necessity. A little bit about me. I grew up on the USA-Canada border. And just to answer George's kind of presumed question there, it's 9:30 a.m. thereabouts in Western United States. And so I am well caffeinated, but did not have any trouble being awake for this particular time. I did grow up on the U.S. side of that border, but I did listen to a lot of Canadian radio, so I'm pretty familiar with the whole metric system to imperial conversion things. I understand that most of the nations in the world use the metric system. That's not the typical in the United States, but I do talk metric. Professionally, I got a degree in computer science from Clarkson University. It's one of the many universities in New York State. I've spent almost 20 years at Microsoft, so it's quite a while. The first 15 were actually at Microsoft Office. So I spent a lot of time in Microsoft Office working on a variety of products. And now I'm in Visual Studio for the past 5 years. And my slides are not advancing. There we go. Right now I work on tooling for .NET apps to get the application from the developer's machine and into Azure. Some other stuff, I do hike, lots of small hikes. Occasionally there's a big hike. Mount Whitney and Mount Rainier are both kind of big in the United States. Here's me at the top of Mount Whitney in 2019. And again, for the metric thing, that's 4,400 meters. So that was quite the view from up there with nothing around me for thousands of miles. You can't see that far, but that is how prominent it is. What are we going to go through today? Enough about me. We're going to build a microservice that's backed by a database. We're going to locally run and test it. We're going to publish to Azure. We're going to make a second microservice that runs locally. It's not going to use a database. We're going to publish it to Azure, and we're going to hook the two microservices together. It should all work. And it should be that the one microservices calls the other. We're not going to use any sort of pub sub messaging RabbitMQ that we were discussing in the lead up to the start of the talk. We're going to use HTTP. A couple of notes. Not everything is going to work the first time. And I'm actually doing this on purpose because when you are doing this later, I'm not expecting you've carefully transcribed down every little word I've written or everything I've said, because I'm going to write almost nothing. You're going to run into problems and say, oh, how do I fix that? And by going through the diagnosis part, I hope to give you something that you can say, I know how to fix this. I remember seeing this thing. Let me go and actually solve the problem and be a little familiar with this error means this solution. Explanations will be somewhere between very vague to very specific. If it's things I personally worked on, they can be really specific. If it's something that one of my teammates worked on recently, I probably know a good amount. If it's something that's existed for a while, I may or may not know things about it. There's lots of people who contribute to Visual Studio, and like all software, it's built on the previous sort of software. So I just want to make sure that's clear. If I don't have an immediate answer, you've asked a great question, and I'd probably love to know the answer. I just don't know it yet. This is the most recently released preview of Visual Studio 2022. So it'd be 17.2. I think preview 6 released yesterday. I might have the number wrong, but it was yesterday. Okay, on to the demo. Like I said, not too many slides. So here we have Visual Studio. We're going to make a new project. I actually need a code name from somebody in the audience just to prove that it's all new stuff. So if anybody wants to pipe up, chat, or otherwise, and George can relay it or whatever.
A code name.
Code name.
Okay, Rainer. There is one in the chat.
So
Dr. Doom.
file
We have a
new.
lot of...
No, that's all I need. I just need a word to start with. So we're going to start with a web API application. Now, I could probably start with just about any of the templates and then add the right packages and do the right hookup in startup.cs or program.cs, depending. But I'm going to start with this template because it actually does most of the interesting hookup necessary for API microservices in its initial state. So if I heard correctly, somebody grabbed onto the place that I hiked previously, Rainier. Is that correct? Awesome. Now I'm going to ask one more question before I do anything else. Can people actually see my screen and see what I'm typing?
I can. I hope everyone can. Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
We
As
have
long as
a
if
lot
I
of
need to
thumbs
zoom
up.
in, I'd like to zoom in now and not 5 minutes from now. But this is about as small as the font gets. So, or as about as small as the display gets. So one of the interesting things we're going to have here is that it's going to have open API support. That's going to allow us to do some of the microservices tooling inside of Visual Studio. And this is .NET 6 for people who want to do things with .NET 5 and .NET 3.1. Of course, the exact techniques will vary a bit. I think .NET 5 is where this enable open API support starts showing up in the project template in Visual Studio. So we'll click create. This is actually going to create us a solution and create us a project. We're going to come over here. I'm going to demo the initial state, like how the template actually created it. So I'm just going to press F5. F5 is the compile and build command. It'll pop up the web browser and it will give me the ability to interact with the microservice, the very simple microservice that's actually built into this particular template. I will fix my eye line by moving the image from Teams to the top right, so I'm looking somewhere near the top of the screen. So here we have a page that allows us to explore, this is actually built into the template and the packages, allows us to explore the APIs that are exposed by the project. And so the only method here is this /weather forecast. We can try it out. We can run it. And we get back a set of date times, temperatures, and a summary for it. So mild, cool, mild, mild. Everything here is random. The only thing that's really not random is the temperature calculation between Celsius and Fahrenheit is actually accurate. But everything else is random, and that's okay, because it just shows the basics. And if we had a more interesting service, which we'll build, then we'd be able to test it out in here and be able to see it actually functioning. So let's actually close the page. And Visual Studio automatically stops debugging. Just a quick tour of the code. Here's the actual model that's being sent, the date, temperature. Here's the temperature conversion. There's a string that's a summary, and the controllers. One of these random summaries is actually put up, and here's the random temperature. So that's how all of that works. That's just to give you the quick tour so you know what we're starting from. So
Bill?
Yes.
Sorry, can I interrupt you because
Totally.
I don't yeah. There are some questions already in the chat. The one was please elaborate on that OpenAPI checkbox. I don't know, probably it's the one that you used in the template. Does it by default open in Swagger? And what template did you start with?
ASP.NET Core Web API is the template I started with. And one of the main things that the OpenAPI checkbox is going to do is it's going to add this package reference to swashbuckle.ASP.NET Core, which brings with it a bunch of tooling. And in addition, this use Swagger UI is the thing that generates the web page that I was just on. So I hope that helps to answer it. I mean, there's actually quite, I'm making that statement, and I'm looking back on it and saying, which particular things are the actual points? Because there's the API Explorer. This is the ability to generate Swagger. This is actually having the Swagger UI. So I know that when in development, it's the only time you get the Swagger UI. So I'm pretty confident on that one. What the specific API Endpoint Explorer does, I'm a little more fuzzy on. But that should mostly answer those. Do you feel like there's a question I haven't answered yet? Okay.
For me,
Good.
no, but let's see. Yeah.
So let's grab some code. So here's our scenario. People have been working in a more distributed way the past couple of years. We have to worry about things like time zones and such, but we're actually going to talk about the temperature where people are. We're going to build a little service where people can put in their name and they can put in the temperature where they are, and so that we can all share whatever that team looks like. And we're going to do it all API level. I'm not going to build any web pages. That's not what we're doing today, though one could build a web page that talks to it. So let's make a new class, and let's go to our slide deck, because I actually put the code in the slide deck so I could have one file to move around. So here's our code. I only have 3 of these. We're going to have team member info. Part of me really wants this file to be called team member info. Great. Now we have this key attribute, and the key attribute does have a very specific use. We're going to add the using that goes with it based upon Visual Studio's existing knowledge of what attributes likely come from what namespaces and the actual set of assemblies that are being referenced through all the packages and such. This is used for Entity Framework. So Entity Framework, I can't go into huge amounts of detail there based upon what I've worked on and what I haven't, but Entity Framework is a standardized. It's a set of libraries shipped by Microsoft that enable database access from APIs. So you can do the normal sorts of CRUD operations against a database based upon, I have a data structure, I want to actually make use of that data structure with that database. So having made the data structure, the model one could call it, we need to actually add the information about and the APIs for the database. So we'll come in here, we will add a new scaffolded item. Now we also have that new item button, and I like to think of scaffolding as a way of generating some code resource potentially based upon some other code resource. So the code that's going to be generated actually understands the contents of the class that are involved, and it's not just a new page and it's a blank kind of hello world page. So API controller with actions using Entity Framework is going to be the scaffolder that I choose. I need to choose my model class. It's actually going to be that team member info. I'm going to make a new DB context class. This is part of that generation of code based upon code. And I'm going to actually add it, and it's going to install some packages and generate some code, add it to the solution or add it to the project, etc. Now it's building the project. That puts me into a known state since it just added package references and code. This is a good thing to know if there's any issues when you start. So let's look at some of the code that it generated. Generated a new controller. It's got a get all sort of API. It's got to get a particular one. This value at the end has to be the, what was I going to say? Has to be the ID, has to be that key property from the actual data model. We can actually also update one. We can create one. Now I'm actually doing all this because we're going to come back in here and we're actually going to modify the code later, because this is where the hookup is going to occur. And we can delete one and we can run it locally. So I pressed F5. It's going to start it up. And now, in addition to that weather forecast that's part of the pre-generated template, we have team member infos. And we can get the list of team member infos just like before. We're going to try it out. We're going to click execute. This is interesting. We got an error. This is one of those places where I knew there was going to be an error. The login failed for the database. And here's the name of the database. And you'll notice it has our keyword for the day, Rainier. So there's no way this is a pre-existing database. So clearly something has occurred that has put us in a state where things aren't going to work. And we're going to figure out the answer. So we've got this Rainier context, some string. We could search around for it. Rainier context. Now we know that we probably have some classes with that name, but let's find something else. We have a connection ID. We have a connection string. There's the name of the connection string. And am I missing it? Well, we know we have a connection string with this name. Entire solution, match case. Did I misspell something? Well, I know where it is. So I will need to figure out why this is not being found by the search, because that is actually kind of interesting. But we have a connection string called Rainier context because, like I said, we were going to build a microservice that's backed by a database. An entity framework is backed by a database. And we're actually set up to use local DB initially. However, that local DB doesn't have the right schema. And in fact, doesn't really have the database right now. What it has is this idea that there should be a database there. We need to actually generate the database. So Entity Framework has a concept for this. I'm going to bring us over to Connected Services. Connected Services says, hey, we have a SQL Server Express local DB. It's running locally, but it doesn't have the right content in it. Just because there's a DB server doesn't mean there's really a database, really with a login, really with the right schema. And so there's two steps that need to be taken. The first one is to add a migration. And an Entity Framework migration is basically a database upgrader that allows the database to be set up for a particular context. And right now it's retrieving the names because it has to use a .NET command line tool and get the responses. And I believe for the .NET command line tool to run, it needs to build the DLLs and then do reflection over them to find classes that meet particular types. So we're going to build the content, the migration. This is basically going to generate some code into my solution, into my project, that will set all that up. And we can actually look at the migrations if we really want to. And so I'm not going to go deep into it, but it's create table and adding columns. And then here's a snapshot so it understands what was a previous state based upon a previously generated migration. So going back to Connected Services, we will update the database, which basically means run the migration. So now the table will be there, and the database will be there, and the login will be there, and everything will be right.
Who creates the database in this case? Because the migration only creates the table, right?
So let's actually look at the migration in more detail. You are correct. So this is local DB. And so I'm perhaps not thinking super carefully about at what moment the database is, at what moment is the database server created? I believe it's already running because it's local DB. At what time is the specific database created? I don't think there's been any calls effectively yet, but I think that's maybe where I need a little bit more detail to answer the question. If there is somebody who really understands entity framework in detail, that would be a great answer to source from the audience.
Yeah, I was also a bit confused with the question. Is it what's the exact moment that the database is created? Was that the question?
Yes, basically. So previously we ran it, right? And it was getting an error because the DB didn't exist. And now we added the migration, which just generated code.
Yeah,
So
and
far.
yeah, understood.
So when you run the update database, it compares the database and the migration to what's in the local database, and if it's not there, it creates the database at that time.
Could be. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
I hope my literal thumbs up are visible through the camera. Now I've learned something. So I've hit F5 again. Page comes back up. Try it out. Execute. And it comes back with a 200 and an empty response body. Success. It actually was able to contact the database and read from the table. The table exists. No data came back. Great. Let's actually add one. We come over down here to post. Try it out. It's about 50 degrees out here, so I'll just put in 50 for Celsius and Fahrenheit. This should tell you, maybe signal a little bit about what we're going to do in the future. George is a member of the team, and we're going to execute. Okay, success, came back. All right, let's come up here. Let's execute our get all query again. And now we actually see in the response, in the list of all the team member infos, there's George, and it's 50 degrees in Celsius and Fahrenheit where he's at. We can also modify one, so we can try it out. The ID is George. Make it 40 degrees.
There's a question here, when you have a minute, and he's asking how the migration and database creation could work when you're using GitHub Actions to deploy to Azure App Service.
That is, we're going to get to some of that, but we're not going to get to all of that. And I don't currently have a good answer for GitHub Actions plus Entity Framework in Azure, but it does sound like a great problem to solve. And maybe somebody else has solved it and I'm just unaware of the solution.
Okay, let's discuss that later. I do have to contribute something here, but let's discuss that later when the time comes.
Okay, we have a locally running microservice doing some simple operation that we can run it. I can actually set a breakpoint if we need to set a breakpoint. I assume we've all used the debugger. You can trust me that the breakpoints work though. We're going to publish out to App Service. So Azure App Service. Let's actually make a new instance out in Azure. Now we can have our code name and the thing that we created. So this is actually going and contacting Azure and creating an Azure App Service using an existing hosting plan. App Service plan, it's got a couple of names. If you look in the API, it's microsoft.web/serverfarms. So it's got a couple of names. Internal server error. That's interesting. Give it one more shot, and then I will use an existing one. That was an unusual response for me to see. Seems to have gone a bit longer, so we'll assume that it's working. So this should probably take a minute and a half, 2 minutes total. Is there another question sitting in the chat? Okay, well, I'm going to go with there's no current questions waiting, and that's fine.
And guess what? I was speaking and I was in mute, this common phrase. But I was saying that there is no question. There are some questions in meetup.com platform that I was busy answering, but I see now that there is also no question. There is one right now. Are we currently waiting for a database to be created?
We are not waiting for a database to be created. This is actually the app service out in Azure. We'll get to the database in a few minutes. Database server creation actually takes a long enough amount of time. I've done that in advance. So I understood that to take a bit more time. It's not a huge amount of time, but it's a couple minutes more than I think was worth everybody else's time. Database creation is a bit faster once the server is in existence. Two internal server errors in a row. So let's use an existing instance and move on. So this is an API, and we could certainly test it by hitting the correct URL through the web browser, and we could get back responses, and we could carefully craft up post and put and all that. But Microsoft has an API management solution, I'll call it, and I'm not a marketing person, so I can't tell you all the great things it does. However, when I think about it, I think about the fact that it produces an API, not only that I can test easily through the browser, which we'll get to, but that I can use as a facade redirect between some other application and my actual app service, so that if I want to have a different version and I want to swap between backend versions, I don't need to update all my apps. They can still talk to this API that is available through API management. And API management has a server and it has APIs within it. We will be creating a new API in a few minutes, but I'll leave my API creation stopwatch time for that. So we're going to make the publish profile. Okay. So let's publish this out. We've created the profile. We've set things up. We've made sure all the resources are there. Let's actually hit publish. Publish is going to do compile. It will typically do a release compile as opposed to debug, which is what I was doing locally. It's also because there's always different versions of different versions of .NET and different versions of .NET running on app service. It's actually comparing what I have locally with what's available in the app service that I'm trying to publish to make sure that my app has a chance of actually working. And since Net 6 is LTS and has been out for a while, this should be no problem, but it is making some network calls and doing some comparison to figure that out.
There are a couple of questions that we can try and answer up until this is done. One is why deploy to an app service versus a function app, Azure function, I guess, as this is a microservice. So probably choose, you mean, Yatis, if you want to elaborate, choose either an app service or an Azure function.
So I'm actually, for the second microservice, I'm going to make an Azure function with an HTTP trigger. So we're going to do that. And you can now do SQL bindings and Azure functions, which there previously, I don't think there was like a template and a set of function extensions to do it. I might be what's easily available and what some custom solution has built. Could be different, but if you're going to do something backed by Entity Framework, this felt like the natural path based upon the tooling. And then on the function side, I'm certainly going to do an Azure function. I'm going to hook the two services up. So we will also see publishing to a function app. That's the one where I'm going to create the API management resource so that we can do both basically. And what was I going to say? So I think it's a great question, and how you make the decision between which, it's both like which project template you use impacts what sort of thing you can target. So it's how do you make that the right decision up front? I'm not a master of, but I think it's a great question to try to figure out if you know exactly what you want to do, what you want to accomplish in the end, what's the right project template to start with. I think is a very reasonable topic of exploration. And I haven't personally used the SQL bindings in Azure Functions yet.
Okay.
So.
Okay, I think, yeah, that is actually a bit more complicated, the choice between an app service and another function. There is another interesting question, although it might be answered partially by John, a question by Siegfried. It's a talk about security, right? Is the database connection string deployed with the application? Is that safe? Yeah. What's the difference between using an app config and the app settings feature of the app service web apps?
Sure. So probably the safest way to do it is to use a key vault. So you store the actual connection string in the key vault. Then your app service is able to get the URL of the key vault using MSI, is able to get access to the key vault and get out the connection string, and then be able to access the database. So there are two, we'll say, other methods. One is to actually have it be a part of the project. And one problem I would say, and like for instance, the app settings.json here for the local development, this is where it was generated to. And A, this won't work in Azure, and B, it means that if you had multiple instances in Azure, they would all share the same string, which kind of works if they're all actually the same use of the microservice, but wouldn't work if you're trying to make some sort of library that other people could use, where they put in their own connection string to their own database and they get this standardized API platform on top of their customers' data, their products' data. So certainly, this is great for getting started, this particular putting in the app settings JSON, but it definitely has some, we'll call them drawbacks. And I wouldn't do that for a production app to like publish out the actual production connection string in the artifacts. Like that should come from some level of config. Now we could go and put it into the app settings. Oh, it's restarting the web server, make sure that everything's in a good state. That's because it added a site extension that I believe that one is for improved logging, though I won't speculate anymore. You could put it in the environment variables, but this means that anybody who has access to do the get on your app service from a configuration Azure resource perspective also has the right to read what's in the key vault, or not read what's in the key vault, read the connection string, which is not the right separation of concerns. So here's the app, it's starting up. The page doesn't exist, and the page doesn't exist because there is no page at the root. There's no controller that handles the root. This is the API app. Coming in here, I'll just briefly show, you can manage app settings, and you could, in theory, set up a connection string value in here, and then it would be environment variable as far as the processes, and it'd be able to load in the constructor here. But I suggest the key vault. So let's go and manage let's go try out the API. So here's Rainier. Here's get weather forecast. We're going to skip that one. We're going to do the get just like we did before. We're going to test it out. And we're going to get all of the team member infos, send. So it's actually warming up the app service in order to get the data back from it. And we've gotten an error, internal server error. Now, the questions that people have been asking actually predict what the error is, but I'm going to take us through how you would figure out the error a little bit more directly, just so that we can see it. Now, this error might mean that the process is up and running and it's returning an error response, or it might mean that the process for some reason is not running. Assuming that the process is running and simply is returning like a valid, exception was thrown, we can attach the debugger and we can remotely debug that the app service out in Azure and find out what's going on.
So there is a question here by Marcus. How do you implement in a web API HTTP patch command using JSON merge patch? How do you differentiate between values that are null that were not provided? I'm not very sure. Yeah, please.
I actually, I understand the question, and I believe, if I remember, there's an RFC on ietf.org that describes the pattern. I might be wrong on that, but I do seem to remember that being the being how JSON patch is supposed to be implemented. So what if there? So I'll step back from the I'm pretty sure there's an RFC on it to if there's a standard on it, I think we should just follow the standard. And then is there code that follows the standard? My answer is probably yes, but I'm not familiar with it.
Okay. There is another one by there are a couple of questions. If you have time, we can go through them now.
Let me go to the next kind of wait point.
Okay.
I just want to show that we are where we are.
Makes sense. Yep.
So the following module is built with optimizations enabled. That's because it's a release build. And I'm going to disable just my code and continue so that it will make it possible to debug. But really what I'm going to care about in the watch window is exceptions. And we'll come back to this and we'll hit send again. And Control-Alt-E, no. Control-Alt-E should bring up the debug windows, exception settings, break on all exceptions. This has been one of my very favorite features in Visual Studio when working with .NET for a long time, is the ability to break when the exception is thrown. Okay, SQL exception. Server was not found or was not accessible. Verify. Unable local database runtime, because we're still using that connection string that's in app settings.json, even though we're on app service, and even though we really don't want that to work. We don't expect it to work. We don't want it to work. We don't want it to work that way. So let's go work with the database. Now, if we go back to our publish page, at the bottom of it is this idea that we need to connect to a database, but doesn't actually say connected. So we will connect. And we will choose an Azure SQL database. And it's pulling from my subscription. Here's a new DB that I created earlier. We can actually create new databases and new servers. but it takes a bit of time, particularly for the server. So we will hit next. We will store it in Key Vault. Next. We need to make a new Key Vault. Key vaults are fairly fast to make. So this is making the Key Vault. When I get to the end of this flow, it's actually going to enable the apps, the managed identity on the app service, and then grant permissions for the app service to talk to the Key Vault. It's also going to store the correct secret in the Key Vault, the connection string that was generated there on the previous page. So it's going to, and then it's going to inject some code to make this all work. The URI itself is going to be stored in Azure App Settings because there needs to be that initial secret. And here's kind of the short list of things that it's going to do. It's going to add some packages so Key Vault works. And so that was Key Vault working. Here's some related to Entity Framework and databases, though we already know it's working with Entity Framework. We come back here to program.cs, and here's actually where the Key Vault is added. Now, back to our app, we've actually changed the code. We've also changed the configuration somewhat. We will hit publish again. Now we'll have the right secret in the right place, and that should just work. And because it doesn't actually add anything, I'll say that I also need to make sure that I've got entity, the EF migration has to run, and there's a different way to run the EF migration. This publish, having done a previous publish, should be quite a bit faster. So perhaps I should talk about that. Oh, I know what's going on. Show all settings. So I want to Entity Frameworks migrations, apply this migration on publish. Save. Now, let's publish. Okay. I'm just trying to do the quick debug here on the fly because I do want everything to be successful. But I also want to be talking about best practices and demonstrating best practices. So I'm trying to work out the best way forward here. Let's go back to connected services. We now have this idea that there's a Vault URI. So let's connect to a Vault. Yeah. Make a new Vault. So basically what's happening is because the program.cs now has a reference to the Rainier context variable, when running some of the .NET tools that actually need to do inspections of the code or actually run a little bit of the code and run the program.cs, we now have in effect, null variable. And that's what's causing an issue there. So this will set up a different key vault to be used locally, so that at least if we were to do F5, that would be used. And the other thing we can do is we can say, I don't actually know if that's going to work, but as long as it doesn't need to really contact the key vault for anything, it seems quite reasonable. Okay. I really don't want to get stuck here, but okay, so clearly it's using example.org at design time for that as well. So
Suggestion from Yatis is that your connection string is still local DB.
if it were using the local DB connection string, there would actually be no issue. So I can take this and put it in that other key vault, and it would work it would have exactly the same effect. The problem is that the vault URI is not being set to a value maybe this is my key. So now it'll actually be used at local time. So now to get there. Good suggestion though, like to make sure so I will be deleting all of this when I'm done, just in case there's some. That's actually where I want to go. Okay. So here's what I'm going to do. I will do that. And then for the publish profile, come over here. And there's actually a link to the supported design time patterns. We'll store it in the environment variable, though, on the app service. I'm the only person who can find this particular subscription anyways. I don't think the subscription ID will be visible at any point during this, so, though it might. I'm glad to use all the pieces together. I'm glad to figure out what would be challenging for a customer. But I also want to make good use of the time of everybody on the call. So
yeah, and there's your subscription ID. That's what you were talking about. Yeah.
Yep. Well, like I said, it will be gone shortly.
I will try to blur it out, but probably we need to.
Yeah, oh, it's going to be gone. Don't worry about that. Okay, that should all work. Okay. Aha. I had a subtle change in my order of operations, and so the correct connection string was not available for doing the EF migration on the server as part of publish. That's what that was. So now that we're back on track, everything should work.
Let's hope Murphy doesn't disagree.
I've met that person.
You did?
Okay, but we're right where we were. Now we'll hit send. EF migrations ran as part of publish. We have access to a database at runtime, and we get back blank set. And I'll just quickly make another one of these just so we can have something to work with. 30 and 50 and okay. Back to the get. Oh, did I actually hit send or not? I must have. Great. Okay, we now have one microservice working out in Azure, fully backed by a database using Entity Framework. Now, let's make a second one. In this case, I'm pretty good at the Celsius to Fahrenheit conversion. Actually, I know that 30 and 50 are very, very different. 30 is Celsius, I would say, is shorts and t-shirt weather, and 50 Fahrenheit is definitely sweatshirt weather. So let's make a microservice to solve that problem for us, that we are somehow expecting the customer to understand how to do the conversion flawlessly every time, which I don't think is very fair. And to do this, we're going to actually use an Azure function that uses an HTTP trigger. So Azure Functions is the template. I want to make sure I don't go too fast there. Rainier conversion. Now we're going to do the Open API, the HTTP trigger with Open API. The default for, I believe your first time through is HTTP trigger. We actually want the one with Open API, which will have some additional attributes and libraries installed to make it easier to do all the work. And now we're going to hit create. It's going to create for us the template. And then if we go to my slide deck, go to snippets 2, just to make it a little bit easier. That's the name of the function. Here's the name of our parameter so that it's obvious what to do. And we're going to change the body to be this code. I'll let the eyes linger on it a bit more. So what's it going to do? It's going to read from the query string temp C. Temp C, of course, is Celsius. We're going to parse it. We're going to turn it into Fahrenheit using a pretty standard algorithm. And then we're going to round it, and we're going to make it an int, and we're going to send it to string so that it comes out as a string. Even though it would accept a double on the way in, it will only output a whole number integer value for the Fahrenheit or Celsius. So, and I've chosen that if it's invalid, it's going to be minus 40. Minus 40 is the point where Celsius and Fahrenheit are actually exactly the same temperature. We can run this locally. Oh, one of the things, and I actually did this in a recent practice, is that it's still running. You can see that Rainier is in bold. That is the startup project. So when I hit F5, it's actually trying to start that one. And we want to switch to starting the function, which will enable us to debug and run the function at first. So this is using a func.exe. That is the functions core tools is what the, and since I'm in the middle of debugging, I still had breaking all exceptions on. So what it's going to do is it's going to emit for me a number of URLs. And the last one of those URLs is a very similar to web page to what we were using before. I'm actually going to okay, so render Swagger UI is an auto-generated HTTP function that comes from one of the libraries that was installed as a result of using the HTTP trigger with OpenAPI. And I'll actually note which particular NuGet package later. And what it will do is it will give us that same experience we had before. So let's go to a web browser. And let's try it out. What's a good starting value? A, because we know it's not a string. We'll see what we get. We expect minus 40. There's minus 40. 0 Celsius is 32 Fahrenheit. 98.6. Oh no, that's 37 Celsius. It should be either 98 or 99. I'm going to say 99 Fahrenheit. Body temperature. 100 Celsius is 212 Fahrenheit. Okay, I feel like that's a pretty good set of tests. One last one is actually the minus 40, and it's minus 40. So we know we can do negatives. Not really worried about getting that one right. I think it's a pretty straightforward algorithm. But now we have this service working. Let's publish it out to Azure. Azure function app. Need a new one. So it actually has to make a storage account as well, and that's where logs and other things get stored as part of the storage app, as part of the function app. Is it logs? At one time. Certainly, the deployed application I'm about to upload will be stored in the storage account. So are there any more questions while we're waiting a moment for this?
Yeah, there are some questions actually. Need to scroll up because there is also a very interesting discussion going on. So one is by Siegfried. Is this API a candidate for easy auth?
I have not delved perhaps enough into the details of the different auth strategies. That probably could be its own separate talk pretty easily.
Yeah.
So
I do think
I'm gonna. That's as much of an answer as I have. But that's a lot
Yeah.
less about the tooling as it is about the actual like what is running.
Yeah, and the choice, right? Sometimes it's even a business or a technical choice of what the authentication will be behind. So there is another question. There is a question by Chris. Forgive me if I'm not pronouncing the name correctly. How is remote debugging working if it is published with the release configuration to Azure?
That's a very reasonable question. So the process is still there. The DLL is still there. I've disabled just my code, and so the level of debugging I did was actually I want to know what exceptions are thrown, which is something the runtime certainly knows about, and what is the kind of the message stack trace in the section. Now, the stack trace wouldn't necessarily have line numbers if you didn't have a PDB, but it has method names. Now, if the resulting application were obfuscated, then certainly the names would be very different. And certain things might be inline. So the call stack might not actually match what I'm expecting as the developer, but it might. Now, if somebody were paying attention really closely, they could say, oh, maybe your code came up, in which case I have a local PDB that exactly matches. But I personally was not looking in great detail for that.
Mm-hmm.
So. Vernier conversion. So here I am going and making an API management API. So an API is a sub-object of a server. And they have to have different URL suffixes so that you can actually address different sets of methods separately. And you can think of each one of these APIs as being described by a single Swagger JSON.
I can continue with questions whenever you have time. But
sure.
That was a quick one.
That was a quick one. Like if I made the server would be several minutes, which is part of why I did that previously. But in this case, I know that the API is a much lighter weight object. So we're going to make the publish profile. This is very similar to the app service one. I'm going to hit publish to get things out there. There's no database involved. There's no database migrations involved. There's no key vault involved. This should go very quickly. But one thing that it's going to do is because there's that library that actually exposes the Swagger document, it's actually able to register if you've done a lot of things in Azure and you've done a lot of things in the Azure portal. Under an app service, you can actually say, here's the Swagger that defines the APIs of this particular app service. And because on the function side, we know exactly what API, what URL on the server is going to produce the APIs, like produce the Swagger JSON listing. We're actually able to publish it out in Azure that way. So it's one of the API endpoints on the function app that I'm creating here. And that will be important because that's actually how we find it from our initial service, is the fact that it's listed as the API endpoint there. So yeah, it's publishing it out. It is actually going to then not only set the API endpoint on the app service, it's going to create and push the Swagger JSON itself to the API management instance, so it'll be available if we want to debug it or test it out in the portal like we did with the previous one. Looking at the time, I'm actually going to skip it because it's very much the same experience we've already seen, both locally debugging it as well as remotely trying out the Rainier service here. Waiting for the function to be ready. We're actually going to set this as the startup project because I know we need to do that to keep going. But I'm going to look down here in this window and make sure that all the parts are ready for us. Gotten to the end of my glass of water here. Do we have one more question?
Yeah, we do have one more. We have more, but at least one more. Visual
Sure.
Studio by Siegfried. Siegfried is saying anyway that Visual Studio has some options for generating deployment scripts, right? When you want to publish something.
Mm-hmm.
Can Visual Studio create a script that would include the newly created key vault?
There's two different ways that I can take that question. Can it produce a script that will create the key vault would be one question. And could it create a script that binds the key vault to the, we'll say, app service? I'm not sure, like, I can say that the answer is it does not currently do either. But if we're talking about GitHub Actions, then it seems like something that I actually don't even know. Well, let's see. There's definitely the ability to run AZ-CLI commands inside of a GitHub action. So one may be able to craft their own carefully, but we don't currently have any tooling to make that a really easy scenario, either creating it or binding it. And I think if you created it, you would also want to bind it.
Yep.
Okay, we're going to add a service reference. Coming back to the demo, adding a service reference.
Mm-hmm.
This is OpenAPI. This is a thing in Azure. And the API endpoint is that function app we just did. We just published. So we're going to hit finish. This is going to generate some code into the project using NSWAG. Give it a moment to actually finish generating the code. We can actually go take a quick look at the code. I'm actually trying to pay attention to the time. I'm glad we've been able to do some questions while we're going, but I'm not. I definitely want to make sure there's real time at the end as well. This is Okay, my internal stopwatch. George, is there another question?
Well, yeah. Where does the environment variable Vault URI get set? Is there a difference between, and this is the second question, or is there a difference between local and app service for setting that environment variable? Yep.
Okay, so there's a couple of places that environment variables can come from. When it comes to running things locally, there is such a thing as a launch profile. I actually can't get to it while it's doing this. But under properties, there will be a launch profiles.json, and you can double click and you can look in it and you can see a specific environment variable section. You can also go to project, debug, build, the bottom of one of these menus. I'll really briefly show it. There's a UI where you can get to the same place. You can get like an actual UI, not looking at raw JSON. And you can set environment variables there. You can use environment variables with which Visual Studio is started. You can, I think that's the two normal injection points for running locally to get environment variables. Now you can also do, then there are settings, app settings, and user secrets.json, which is not directly displayed, but you can get to it through UI. I think the deal here is, by the way, that I cleared my package cache, and it's taking some time to download. Is that the settings can come from more locations. You just can't have settings that influence where settings can come from in the place that settings come from. You have to have it somewhere higher level, like an environment variable. So on app service, you can do environment variables through the Azure app settings, in effect. I can't think of another place to do it, though the connection strings are actually, the connection strings collection on app service is actually also flattened and available in environment variables.
Is there an order which, if you have set your environment variable in more than one place?
There is an order. Now, can I tell you emphatically what the order is? The answer is no, in part because it's actually possible to influence the order.
So from the startup CS or program CS, anyway.
It would be program CS. Well, again, we can look at the code. You can actually
yeah.
There's the builder and there's the builder.services.
Yeah.
So program.cs or startup.cs has to do with whether you have a implicit or explicit hosting.
I'm scrolling for more questions. Have you? Oh no, that's not for you. Will you send out the deck after the meeting?
I would be happy to. I don't know what specific, like, I can send it to George, and George can do whatever George wants to do. One of the things that one of the reasons I put the code snippets in the actual PowerPoint deck is to actually make them available to you. Not because I think that they're out of this world creative solutions, but this is the thing that you need to plug in. And it's like, this is the one attribute, or this is like how you return from the Azure function, or in this case, how you call the Azure function API from the app services API. It's like, there's a little bit of hookup in there that's not super trivial. It's easy enough if you know where to search, but if you don't know where to search, this will tell you where to search. I think might be a good way to think about it. So yeah, totally happy to.
Perfect. Are you up for a new one? I think until all the NuGet packages get downloaded, we still have some time, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so there is a question from Yatis. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. All steps performed to create Azure infrastructure from VS tooling. All steps performed inside VS. Is there a way to convert it to something that could be used in a pipeline, in a DevOps pipeline?
Okay, so couple of things. So the good news is, well, the good news is yes and no. So the the actual creation of the Azure resources, we do have a button where you can export the template. So you can actually get a deployment template that you could include by whatever technique you want in order to create the resources. When you have your project hosted in GitHub, we give you the ability to generate a GitHub action where instead of pressing the publish button like I've been doing, you would actually be able to, on every check-in to such and such a branch, typically main, that you would then be able to have it push to the app service that you've selected. That one does not actually go and create any resources though, because the assumption is that you've configured everything that you need. You've done your infrastructure pieces, and that it's only the code changes that you want to represent as part of the GitHub action to actually represent those pieces of it. So I think that the tooling will help you somewhat, but will not get you everywhere you want to go, if I'm understanding the question correctly.
Yep, I think you do. Although I think we are talking something like about infrastructure as code how to pass from this configuration thing from Visual Studio to having a script or a YAML or something that could be part of a pipeline and distributed. I assume, I don't know. If you want to elaborate more on that, Yatis, feel free. Let's see if there is any other question. Where can I find the recording? Yeah, the recording will be in meetup.com. I will publish it in both events, in .NET Foundation and in the Munich.NET user group. But you can also find it directly. I will publish it to my YouTube channel. Let's find it right now. So I can. Here you can find the event once published here. But you will also, you can join the, you can keep track of the meetup.com pages and you can find it there. I don't think we have any other question. Since there was a very interesting discussion in between, feel free if I skipped any question to repeat it, or yeah, feel free to ask something new since we're waiting for NuGet.
I am tempted to cancel this and try again, because one would assume that if like there's like a transitive package download, that many of those transitive packages would have already downloaded, and therefore I'm not giving up a lot of time, but I am like the application is certainly responsive, so I don't think it's actually that. Well, I could show the steps again.
Repeating is learning, right?
Okay. Said it needed to be restored. I've restored it. I didn't see anything seemed to indicate an error. Try this once again. Stored, time elapsed, seems to be happy. There. Now that all the packages are there, it's downloading the Swagger from that URL that was previously published by publishing out the Rainier conversion project, and now it's available. Time check on my side, 5 minutes. Okay, see what we can do. So here's the generated code. And I mean, it's doing a lot of stuff. And for somebody who's really interested, you can go to it. Since it's very regeneratable, I wouldn't try to make a lot of changes to it. You can actually like refresh, which will re-download the JSON file and regenerate the code. Let's, though, go and modify our controller to make use of it. So we need to have the right content here. And that actually ended up being called Swagger Client. Okay. And then the last little bit Wherever we accept a temperature in Celsius, we should calculate the temperature in Fahrenheit from it. So put some cases, PowerPoint corrected my C# into English, so it doesn't end up working out quite the same. Okay. So that should temp C. It's backwards. I think it's backwards. Yeah, it's backwards. Okay. And that's for put. We also need to do the same for post. So I previously set the startup project to be the Rainier project. I've hit F5. And we'll do our get. Try it out, execute. There's the one we had before. Let's create a new one. Let's do something that's definitely not right. Try it out, 50 and 50, and fill. So what we're expecting here is that the temperature Celsius will be considered authoritative, and will overwrite the Fahrenheit with a temperature of 122. So that's what we sent in, and this is what we got out. And it is actually calling that service out in Azure to do that conversion. And we should be able to do the same with put. Try it out. George. We'll say it's only 25 in Munich today. We'll leave Fahrenheit empty because it's going to be ignored anyways.
I like the only 25 because that would be perfect, you know. Usually it's much lower than that. It's right now 10. So
10. Okay. And 25 is 77 Fahrenheit. So that seems entirely appropriate to me.
super.
So I could publish this out to Azure and I could test it through the API management page and have it do exactly the same thing. I see that we are short on time, and I think that would be much of the same that we've seen before. So with that, I'm actually going to go back to the slides and go to my last kind of slides. There were two different packages I used, one for ASP.NET, one for the app service, the API app, and one for the function app. Here's a pair of, here are the repos, there are the links, and here's the name of the package that's here. That's like the core of using it. And that's what makes it really interesting and really able to put together by the tooling in this way. I want to call them out in particular. They're not members of my team in any way, but I wanted to call it out because we're making use of it. And then if there's any questions with the remaining time, I'm super happy to answer them.
There's one already, that if there is any kind of enhancements or changes that you should do in order to use Autoscaler for the app service.
I'm not sure how to set up auto scaling on app service in particular. So for Visual Studio, I think we we mostly talk about Visual Studio as being a dev test kind of tool, like make sure the project is working correctly and make sure that it's functionally correct and be able to debug things and throw interesting data at it and try it out. And that when it comes to things like auto scaling, it's more of a what would the ops person need sort of scenario. And I don't believe we have any of the necessary knobs visible in Visual Studio in order to impact the auto scaling.
Yeah, it's a different thing, and there is also a question which, anyway, for a website, I think we need to add the Redis cache to share cookies. Is this necessity for an API?
What do we need to add in order to share cookies?
Yeah, so there is a chance that when we have a website, we might want to do things faster. So we add the Redis. Probably that's what Zig means. We want to add Redis cache somewhere in the middle so we can cache results and do things faster.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what Siegfried wants to ask is how, or if it will be necessary. Yeah, this is again a requirement, but how we can intervene something in the middle that could act as a cache for our results.
How to use Redis as a results cache and make it. I mean, I guess there's two in the middles there. One is between the Rainier and the Rainier conversion, because that one, there's no special data involved there. Like there's no way to invalidate the table of Celsius to Fahrenheit conversion. Like that just is. And so, I mean, there's no reason that really needs to run on a separate service. It's simple enough, but it helps to demonstrate what's going on. In terms of the database results, caching is always the trade-off between like responsiveness and correctness. Like how do you make sure the cache is invalidated? I think Redis is generally very good about that. And we do have the ability to add Redis cache to your website, but the hookup becomes something that's very much custom and up to you. So back in Visual Studio, services, we can actually say I want to use a Redis cache, and it will add the references and it will help you create, whether it's on a container or actually the Azure cache for Redis, it'll help you create the resource. But in terms of how to hook it up, that's really presently on the developer as to which way they want to use it.
Definitely. One question by Abhishek. Sorry about the pronunciation. How will we get the presentation deck? So first of all, feel free to share with me whatever needs to be in there. I will add it in the meetup.com platform as a comment under the event. This recording here, I will publish it to YouTube. I've sent the link again. Do I have it in Clipboard? I still have it. So here it is. It will be here, but you can also find it from the meetup.com platform under the event. You'll also find the links towards what Phil will provide. Yeah, I think that answers that question. Let me rephrase the question. Are there any cookies for a Siegfried? We're coming back to the other question. Are there any cookies to be shared between autoscaler instance?
Oh, okay. If you have multiple instances of an app service, which you can certainly do, have multiple virtual pieces of hardware, how would they be able to share cookies is how I'm kind of taking it. And so then it's extra interesting if it's auto-scaled because you can maybe set up two, but a third one shows up at some later hour because of increased traffic. And I actually don't know how to do that. Like I think I really understand why that's an interesting question. However, I don't know the technique for like, what do you have to share to be able to share the cookies? Is it I'm thinking about ViewState. ViewState's ASP.NET specific stuff as opposed to like cookies generically. I think to share ViewState across machines, they have to have the same HMAC. And I don't know how I would do that in app service. I could also be incorrect about that, but that's my memory.
I think this is also a question about load balancing. Yeah, choosing the correct app service each time that will serve you, and then it will redirect all the cookies and everything into that instance that knows the user. Or I'm not also sure I understood, but this is at least how I am trying to solve these kind of things. That when a specific user needs to visit a specific instance, usually you configure that from the load balancer. But yeah,
Like setting up Affinity.
yeah.
And then new users presumably go to the new instance because it's currently not under load. But
yeah, exactly. I don't know if Siegfried if this is answering your question. Feel free to reach out if you want any other question after the event. I mean, you can always find me. Yeah. Is there anything else? From Yatis, APIs generally won't use cookies. Yeah. Okay. This is answering probably to Siegfried. Any other question, guys and girls here? Because if not, I can take over and yeah, gracefully finish this event. It was really interesting. I know that I want to see the presentation again because it was so interesting, but that there were so many discussions in the chat that I had to also take a look at the discussion, and I missed some points in between, but I will gladly watch the recording again. Let me share my screen for a minute. I think, am I sharing it right now? I don't know. I think I do.
I can see it.
Okay, that's good. I don't see that I'm sharing it, but if you see that, it's okay. Something's wrong with Teams today. Thank you everyone for being here. Again, there is a hand here, isn't it? Let me see. There is a question here by, oh, the hand is gone. Okay, up until we finish this event, feel free to ask any more questions, but I will continue saying that don't forget that where is it? I was recording this event, so I am planning to publish it, right? If you disagree with any of these plan, feel free to reach out. These are my handle, my Twitter handle, LinkedIn, and so forth. You can also scan this QR code here to find me easier. I will try to publish it tomorrow, so you have at least 24 hours of disagreeing with the publisher, and we'll fix things. Don't worry about that. Yeah, I think it was perfect. It was a very interesting night. It is obvious by how much everyone was chatting and discussing and asking questions. I think it would be very interesting to have you more times, maybe in the future, for different events, because you see how active the audience were, how people really liked it. I also enjoyed it very much. If there is no other question, I will end this event now. If you think of any other question after the event, feel free to ask me, and I will either relay questions to Phil or I will try to answer them myself. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you very much, Phil. It was really an honor, and I really enjoyed this presentation. Yeah.
Thank you everybody for having me and listening in and having great questions. And even when I wasn't able to answer them, I can certainly recognize the depth that's in the questions. And that's why they're not easy to answer, and that's why you have the question.
Yeah, no, it was a very interesting talk, a very interesting meetup. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a very nice night and see you soon. Ciao. Bye.